Silence isn't safe because it removes the last barrier between you and what you really are. The moment the noise fades, the mask slips. And under that mask, you find not peace, but a storm that has been waiting for your attention. You don't even need darkness to feel it, just enough stillness. Sit alone in a quiet room, and the walls start breathing. The air feels heavier. The mind begins to show you things it has been holding back all day. Most people never stay long enough to see what happens next. They grab their phone, turn on music, text someone, anything to drown the feeling. But that feeling isn't danger, it's depth. The unease that comes with silence is the psyche trying to speak. When you stop performing, the unconscious finally finds space to move. It brings you what you've ignored: shame, desire, fear, grief. It doesn't come gently because you haven't listened in years. Jung wrote that every unexamined emotion waits in the dark until it can be acknowledged. Silence is the stage where those forgotten actors step into the light. And that's why we call loneliness a kind of pain, because it forces an audience with yourself. There's a story I once heard about a man who went into a cabin to write. No signal, no distractions, just snow and wood and time. He thought it would be peaceful. By the third night, he was pacing the floor, convinced he was losing his mind. He wasn't. He was meeting it. When the social world disappears, the internal one expands. You start to hear the arguments you've been running from, feel the emptiness you've been disguising as productivity, sense the loneliness that lives even inside relationships. And for a while, it feels unbearable. But that moment, the unbearable one, is the threshold Jung spoke about. The place where the outer persona collapses and the true psyche begins to emerge. He called this the shadows approach. Everything you've denied starts to ask for inclusion, not to punish you, but to complete you. Modern life is built to prevent that encounter. We keep ourselves surrounded by sound, by screens, by movement. We call it connection, but it's more often anesthesia. We stay busy so we don't have to notice how fragmented we are. Silence doesn't make you lonely. It shows you the loneliness that was already there. It doesn't create fear. It reveals fear's true face. That's why quiet rooms feel haunted, not by spirits, but by neglected parts of the self. Jung saw this clearly in his patients. The people who couldn't tolerate solitude were often those who had exiled parts of themselves. They were afraid of what would speak if the world went silent. He wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And that's still true. We'd rather drown in distraction than risk meeting the stranger who lives inside. But the thing we avoid is the same thing that could save us. Because silence, as frightening as it is also a teacher. It tells you what the noise has been hiding. It shows you the weight you've been carrying under every performance. The first stage is always terror. The second is tenderness. After the mind stops screaming, something softer begins to emerge. A quiet awareness that watches without judging. That awareness isn't emptiness. It's the start of integration. When you can sit through the discomfort of silence, you begin to separate from your noise. You realize that not every thought belongs to you. Not every feeling requires escape. That's the moment you begin to own your mind instead of being owned by it. Loneliness works the same way. It's not a failure of connection. It's an invitation to intimacy with yourself. Most people think loneliness means something is missing. But Jung would say it's what happens when consciousness expands faster than the world around you. When you can no longer share what you truly see, you begin to feel separate. That separation isn't punishment. It's the price of individuation. To know yourself deeply is to stand apart from the collective for a while, to feel the full echo of your own thoughts, to face the hollow that opens once all external approval disappears. In that hollow, you discover a voice that doesn't belong to culture or family or fear. It's yours. It speaks slowly, like an old language you're remembering after years of silence. But before that voice becomes clear, the mind tries to fill the emptiness with panic. It whispers that you'll be forgotten, unloved, irrelevant. That's the old self defending itself. It believes belonging is safety, and in one sense, it's right. Belonging keeps you alive. But isolation makes you aware, and awareness, though painful, is what makes you whole. Jung said the first step toward wholeness is to stop identifying only with what's conscious. When you sit in silence long enough, you start to feel what else you are. The forgotten child, the hidden rage, the deep tenderness. These are not intruders. They're parts of you asking to return home. That's why silence feels like danger, because it's the doorway back to your own house. And some rooms are still locked from years ago. You don't know what waits behind them. But until you open those doors, you'll keep living as a guest inside yourself. Loneliness is the key that opens those doors. It strips you of distraction until you have no one left to talk to but the truth. And the truth is rarely polite. It asks questions you've avoided. Who are you when no one is watching? What do you actually want? What have you been pretending not to feel? Most people don't want answers to those questions. They want relief. But the psyche doesn't offer relief. It offers reality. And that's why it speaks only in silence. Because silence can't lie. There's a pattern in the stories of those who faced solitude willingly. Hermits, mystics, writers, wanderers. They all begin in despair and end in clarity. Not happiness, exactly, but coherence. They stop running from their thoughts and start living with them. The voices in their heads become less threatening. The darkness becomes familiar. And slowly, they realize that what they called loneliness was actually presence waiting to be recognized. Presence doesn't need noise to exist. It just needs honesty. In the end, silence is not the enemy. It's the environment where truth can breathe. It will show you everything you've buried, but it will also show you what's indestructible. The parts of you that survive the quiet are the parts worth keeping. Everything else was just camouflage. When you can sit in silence and feel the fear without escaping, you begin to sense another kind of sound underneath. A hum, steady and timeless. That's the psyche's heartbeat. That's what Jung called the self. The quiet awareness that holds all your contradictions without breaking. It doesn't demand peace. It creates it. And that's the moment silence becomes sacred. The moment loneliness stops being a wound and becomes a mirror. Because now you see what you were running from all along. Not darkness, but depth. At first, silence feels like a void you fall into. But if you stay long enough, you realize it's not empty. It's alive. It breathes. It watches. It waits for you to stop fighting it. The moment you stop running, silence starts to change texture. It stops being an enemy and starts becoming a mirror. And what it shows you isn't just darkness. It's material. It's the raw matter from which transformation begins. Jung called this descent into the unconscious the night sea journey. The soul must swim through darkness to reach its own depth. Every person who has ever awakened to themselves has passed through this same water. And every one of them was afraid at first. When loneliness feels unbearable, the instinct is to escape, to find a distraction, a new connection, any kind of noise. But if you can resist that impulse, even for a moment, something unexpected happens. The silence starts to reveal patterns. At first, it's just fragments, stray thoughts, memories, images that flash without reason. Then you start to notice a rhythm underneath them, like waves hitting the shore from far away. That rhythm is the unconscious speaking in its own language. Dreams, daydreams, half-remembered phrases, all of it belongs to that same conversation. The psyche doesn't speak in sentences. It speaks in symbols. And those symbols are trying to tell you how to live. The problem is that most people never stay quiet long enough to hear them. Jung believed that creativity is the natural response to solitude. When you stop filling silence with consumption, the psyche begins to create. It paints, writes, dreams, rebuilds. Not because it wants attention, but because creation is how the unconscious finds balance. Every act of art, every new idea, every breakthrough in understanding, they're all attempts to give form to the formless. That's why so many artists say they create from pain. It's not pain itself they're chasing. It's the clarity that follows when pain finally finds expression. So when silence feels unbearable, you can let it destroy you, or you can give it shape. Write, draw, walk, until the noise settles into rhythm. Do anything that translates the inarticulate into movement. That's how loneliness becomes communication again. People think solitude is isolation, but Jung saw it as a sacred laboratory. He said, "In solitude, one's consciousness can hear itself think." When you remove the world's feedback, you start to feel what's authentic and what's imitation. You begin to notice how much of your personality was built for others. The phrases you repeat to sound wise, the opinions you adopted just to belong, the smiles that never reached your eyes. Solitude dissolves all of it. At first, that dissolution feels like death. But what's dying isn't you. It's the false self. The part of you that needed constant validation, that feared being unseen. It can't survive silence because silence doesn't care about performance. It only responds to truth. After a while, something new begins to grow in that quiet space. Not confidence exactly, more like steadiness. You realize you can be alone without being abandoned. You can be still without being stuck. You can exist without explanation. That's the beginning of real strength. It's not loud, it's not showy. It's the quiet certainty that you can face your own mind and remain intact. This is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole by uniting the parts of yourself that were once divided. And wholeness doesn't arrive through perfection. It arrives through contact with everything you are. But there's a danger hidden in solitude too. You can get lost in it. If you stay in the inner world too long without grounding in the outer, your insights start to drift away from life. You begin to mistake reflection for reality. Jung warned about this. He called it ego inflation through identification with the self. It's what happens when someone begins to think the voice of the unconscious is infallible truth. The antidote is humility. You have to bring the inner discoveries back into relationship. With people, with work, with the small routines that keep the psyche tethered. Without that return, silence becomes self-absorption. With it, silence becomes wisdom. That's why even mystics return to villages. Why monks sweep floors. Why Jung himself went back to his family and his patients after his deepest visions. The point of solitude isn't to escape humanity. It's to learn how to meet it more truthfully. Once you start to understand that, loneliness stops feeling like punishment. It becomes preparation. The space where the next version of you is forming. Every person who has truly changed can trace the beginning of that change to a season of silence, a breakup, a burnout, a withdrawal from the noise. In those times, the old identity disintegrates and a new one begins to form quietly beneath it. You can't rush that process. You can only let it unfold, and in the meantime, you endure the feeling of emptiness the way the earth endures winter, knowing it's not death, just incubation. When you start to live this way, your relationship with silence transforms completely. You stop seeing it as absence and start seeing it as a doorway. Every quiet moment becomes a chance to listen. And what you hear in those moments changes over time. At first it's fear, then it's grief, then it's memory, and then finally it's stillness itself. Not empty, not full, just being. That's the moment silence stops being dangerous. Because once you've walked through the fear, nothing it shows you can harm you anymore. Jung often said that wholeness doesn't mean happiness. It means the ability to endure conflict without being torn apart. Silence teaches exactly that. It gives you conflict without distraction. It forces you to stand between your thoughts and your reactions. And in that space, you learn something miraculous. You are not your noise. That realization changes everything. Because if you are not your noise, you can choose your relationship to it. You can hear fear without obeying it. You can witness loneliness without collapsing into it. You can exist with pain without letting it define you. That's inner freedom. The kind that no amount of external comfort can buy. When silence becomes your teacher, you no longer need constant stimulation to feel alive. You begin to seek quiet the way others seek entertainment. You look forward to time alone, because you know that every time you return to that space, you come back clearer, lighter, closer to something true. The people who learn this are never quite the same. They stop chasing noise and start creating meaning. They listen more than they speak. They move slower, but with more direction. They begin to live as if the soul is something real. And that's because they've met it. In silence. In loneliness. In the spaces the world calls empty. There comes a night when the silence no longer feels like a threat. It doesn't close in. It opens out. It stretches around you like a landscape you finally recognize. The same stillness that once amplified your fears now starts to cradle them. It's not that you stopped being afraid. It's that you stopped running. And when you stop running, you discover that fear was never an enemy. It was a signal, a compass pointing toward the parts of you that still needed your presence. Silence begins to reveal its real nature, not emptiness, but space. Space for what's real to emerge. Space for the mind to rest after years of defending itself from itself. You start noticing that loneliness is not always a wound. Sometimes it's a teacher disguised as absence. It takes away what isn't necessary until what remains feels honest. In that stripped-down awareness, the world starts to return, not as noise, but as presence. The ticking of a clock, the faint hum of the city outside, the soft breath of your own existence. Nothing has changed, yet everything feels different. Because silence doesn't change the world. It changes how you see it. This is what Jung meant when he said that the psyche is self-regulating. When you stop interfering, it finds its own balance. Silence gives it room to do that. Loneliness, once accepted, becomes a kind of homeostasis for the soul, a necessary solitude where opposites can reconcile. You realize that all the inner noise wasn't proof of brokenness. It was the sound of reorganization. Like an orchestra tuning before the music begins. And one day, the noise fades, and what remains is harmony. You begin to carry that harmony with you. It shows up in the smallest ways. You listen more when people speak. You no longer rush to fill gaps in conversation. You allow pauses to exist. You start trusting that silence doesn't kill connection. It deepens it. It gives room for what's true to surface. It allows others to breathe in your presence. That's the quiet confidence of someone who has made peace with solitude. They no longer fear the absence of company because they've learned to be company. Not entertainment, not performance, presence. There's a soft strength in that kind of person. They don't need to be loud to be felt. They don't need to prove insight. They radiate calm. Their silence isn't withdrawal. It's clarity. They listen for the signal underneath the noise. In others, in themselves, in life. That's what Jung called the integration of the shadow. When you stop rejecting the darker parts of yourself, they stop fighting for attention. They settle, and in their settling, the whole personality becomes more stable. You no longer have to fear loneliness because you know what lives inside it. You've met the monsters and discovered that most of them just wanted to be understood. In that understanding, creativity wakes up. Because the same silence that once held fear now holds potential. Every idea, every insight, every new path begins in quiet. Noise consumes energy. Silence restores it. You realize why so many thinkers, mystics, and artists retreat into solitude. It's not because they hate the world. It's because they need to hear the world without distortion. They return different because silence rearranges them. But peace doesn't mean withdrawal. Jung never suggested escaping society. He believed that inner work is meaningful only when it returns to the world. So the task is not to stay silent forever. It's to carry silence into the noise, to keep that inner stillness alive even while the world moves around you, to be the calm center inside your own storm. You can practice it anywhere. While listening instead of reacting, while walking without headphones, while breathing before you speak. Each small act is a reminder that stillness isn't isolation, it's alignment. Eventually, loneliness becomes something else entirely. Not the absence of others, but the presence of yourself. You stop seeking company out of fear and start choosing it out of love. You can be with people fully because you no longer depend on them to distract you from your mind. You become capable of true intimacy because you've already made peace with solitude. And when you know how to be alone, you finally know how to meet another without losing yourself. There's a quiet joy that follows. It's not excitement, it's steadiness. You begin to feel gratitude for silence, even for loneliness, because you know what they gave you, yourself. You no longer call silence dangerous. You call it sacred, because it's where every transformation began. In silence, you saw your shadow. In loneliness, you met your soul. In both, you discovered that what you feared was never emptiness, but wholeness, waiting for recognition. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And perhaps that's what silence was trying to do all along. Strip away the noise until only truth remained. Now, when the world goes quiet again, you don't reach for distraction. You breathe, you listen. You let the quiet wrap around you like an old friend returning home. You understand now that silence isn't safe or unsafe. It's honest. And honesty, though it hurts, is the beginning of peace. So when loneliness visits again, as it inevitably will, you don't fight it. You sit with it. You pour it tea. You ask what it came to teach this time, and it always has something to teach. Because loneliness isn't a punishment, it's a pilgrimage, a journey back to the center of yourself. And every time you make that journey, the path becomes a little clearer, the silence feels a little kinder, and the fear feels a little less convincing. That's the quiet miracle of awareness. It doesn't erase pain, but it changes your relationship to it. You no longer need to escape. You simply stay. And in that staying, something divine begins to grow. A presence that has nothing to prove, nothing to hide, nothing to fear. The same silence that once terrified you now feels like home. And the same loneliness that once broke you now reminds you that you were never truly alone. Because somewhere in the quiet, you finally met the only person you were always searching for, yourself.